Buyurun.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining. I'm Kamala Valiyeva, a faculty member at the Department of Political Science and International Relations here at Istanbul Commerce University, as well as a deputy director of the RCNCR, the Research Center for Neighboring Countries and Regions, attached to our department. Here at the RCNCR, we mostly focus on significant and urgent questions concerning economic, political, and socio-cultural issues shaping present and as well as future dynamics of the countries and regions comprising Turkey's immediate neighborhood. And it is my great pleasure today to welcome you to yet another webinar organized by the RCNCR in the framework of a series of our regular events. Today's event will be dedicated to Ukraine, and today we will be talking about one of the most important issues of Ukraine's external affairs, which is the European Union-Ukraine trade relations. And the nature of the EU's engagement policy in this specific country. This is an extremely interesting and indeed involving issue, not just from the Ukraine studies perspective, but also from the EU external relations angle. So, as we all know, among the multiple power concepts concerning the EU's foreign policy actors, such as normative power Europe, global regulatory power Europe, and as well as quiet superpower Europe, and so forth, the EU is also theorized as a trade power or a market power, since the EU holds a considerable power in trade. But at the same time, the EU also projects its power via trade. That the EU traditionally has been devising its trade policy in accordance with the political and value-based conditionality and pursuing the so-called non-trade policy objectives in its trade relations with third parties. So what are the peculiarities of such policy engagement? What are the regional implications, particularly in terms of the countries of post-Soviet Europe? To what extent the EU is consistent in its value-driven trade policy with third countries? What are the challenges which could possibly limit the implementation of such policy, whether stemming from the EU itself or partner countries in the post-Soviet Europe and elsewhere? To discuss these questions and more, we have with us today Dr. Maryna Rabinovych, whom I am very pleased to see again after a long term of years. In a few moments, Maryna will deliver her presentation entitled The EU-Ukraine Deep Trade Agenda, the Impact, Resilience, and Rule of Law Perspective. But before we get started, I would like to briefly introduce Maryna to our audience and also outline enormous work on the issue she has done so far. So currently, Maryna works as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Agder in Kristiansand, Norway, with the research project entitled Lowering the Bar, compliance negotiations and the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, which is funded by the Norwegian Research Council. She holds a PhD in legal studies from the University of Hamburg, a Master's of Law in European Legal Studies also from the University of Hamburg, and Europa College Hamburg, a leading institute for European integration. She obtained her Bachelor of Law degree from Odessa National University back in her home country, Ukraine. Prior to joining the University of Agder, Maryna also worked as an assistant professor at the Department of Public Policy and Governance at the Kiev School of Economics. Maryna's academic interests include legal regulation of the external relations, European differentiated integration and compliance, European neighborhood policy, development policy, as well as trade policy and the EU's promotion of values through trade agreements. She has written extensively on these subjects and has numerous publications. These in particular include an edited volume, Decentralization, Regional Diversity and Conflict, the Case of Ukraine, co-edited with her, which was published in 2020 with Palgrave Macmillan. She has also published her works in international peer-reviewed journals such as East European Politics, Brill Open Law, Journal of Contemporary European Research. Maryna also was an expert under the framework of the German government-funded Migration for Development and the EU-funded Association for EU project directed towards supporting the implementation of the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement. Maryna's latest book entitled EU Regional Trade Agreement, an Instrument of Promoting the Rule of Law to Third States, was published in April this year by Routledge. And this book, I should say, is an important contribution to an extensive literature on EU trade policy. In this book, Maryna introduces the concept of EU value promoting regional trade agreements based on the combination of main premises of foreign policy, rule of law, and development economics perspectives. And doing so, in her book, Maryna focuses on the three cases of EU's individual assistance mechanisms in the Balkans, in this associated Eastern neighborhood, and Caribbean forum countries. The most important part of her book, which is closely related to our today's discussion, is the application of the concept of EU value promoting trade agreements to the cases to the case of EU-Ukraine DCFTA, Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement. So with this short intro and without further ado, let me now turn it over to Maryna. A warm welcome to you, Maryna, and thanks so much for joining us today. And please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kamala. I'm just going to share my screen.
Okay.
So, dear audience, I'm very glad to be here today, at least virtually, and present to you this short research piece on EU-Ukraine deep trade agenda viewed from the impact, resilience, and rule of law perspectives. So to start, as the vast majority of you may have already heard, the Europeanization agreement is one of the most ambitious agreements that the EU has ever developed with any country in the world. And however, when we look at different impact assessments, how the implementation of this agreement is being assessed, you would see that the most often different actors use just the changes in the volume of trade and other quite dry econometric things in order to assess the agreement's implementation, and therefore this contribution is predominantly directed to going beyond this approach and trying to look at the impact, resilience, and rule of law effects the EU-Ukraine deep trade agenda had. I would explain why not the Dcft but the deep trade agenda in a moment. But here, just for those who may not have been acquainted with the association agreement with Ukraine, you could see the major information about it. So the agreement is very large. It comprises more than 1,200 pages. It has a preamble and 7 titles covering very different areas, starting from general principles to the institutional, general, and final provisions, as well as trade and trade-related matters. So this is the core of the deep and comprehensive free trade area. The agreement also includes 43 annexes, and these annexes are predominantly contain Ukraine's obligations as to regulatory approximation, so bringing its legal system closer to the EU system. With these, the paper seeks to complement this dry economics-only perspective that I was mentioning, with a number of insights from the public administration, management and public policy, European studies and development studies literature, to be able to zoom in on what the deep trade agenda really changed in Ukraine. So here I would just briefly introduce some key definitions. When we talk about impact, here we mean the policy's problem-solving capacity plus its ability to reach some structural effects, including the effects on democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. So it's important to distinguish between effectiveness and impact, because when we say effectiveness, we mean the policy's ability to reach its goals. However, impact is a broader category, and it enables us to see not only whether the policy reached its goals or not. This is also quite a dry and narrow estimation of the policy's effects, but impact goes beyond these and also traces these structural changes that I'm predominantly interested in my research. Apart from impact, we also look at resilience. Resilience based on public administration studies and also the novel literature strand in European studies can be understood as the combination of The policy's flexibility and its forward-looking nature. So it means that the policy can adapt to challenges as well as develop itself further. So it's not confined to what is there now, but has some perspectives, some potential to develop, and therefore, like this resilience perspective is also vital when we speak about different integration projects, because they always have to develop and be in motion. Otherwise, they will just die quite quickly. Furthermore, we look at the Dcft as an engine for reforms, the legal gateway to deepen Ukraine's integration into the single market, as well as point to the multiplicity and intertwined nature of different effects produced by the Dcft and the deep trade agenda. So speaking of the theoretical framework, like it's not so easy to develop some compound approach to assessing impact, resilience, and the ability and the treaty's ability to promote the rule of law or other values. Therefore, when we speak about impact and resilience, here I use three major literature strands. These are the literature from public administration, management, and public policy, also from European studies, and here I must say the literature in European studies regarding various policies of the EU is quite expensive. So we can mention at least 4 different literature substrands that are relevant for this kind of research. This is, for instance, the literature on Europeanization and transformation. So basically they use ability to transform political systems in different countries. Just if we use simple language. Also, there is a literature substrand on EU structural power and structural foreign policy. So in this vein, for instance, Ukulele and Delroux, they point to the fact that the EU is able to shape economic, political, cultural, and various other structures in other countries, so that these effects sustain for a long time. So this concept, it goes beyond the traditional normative power Europe one, saying that the EU mostly shapes norms, but it really goes beyond norms and speaks about long-term structures that the country's political system is based on. Also, another relevant literature substrand is literature on the European neighborhood policy and Eastern Partnership, including the recent contributions about unintended consequences of these policies implementation. So I find these so far narrow literature also quite interesting because when we speak about complex political contexts like the European Eastern neighborhood, it's not always easy to think of the consequences a policy can bring about, because these EU policies, they last for a long time and they meet a lot of different challenges, also the geopolitical challenges, for instance, the internal structures, the rule of law challenges, and that's why the policies may produce not only the effects we expect, but also the unintended consequences. And also it's relevant to look at the literature on continuity and change in the European neighborhood and Eastern Partnership, because the way these policies develop are also conditional on the assessments and the way the European decision makers see these policies development. And last but not least, I would like to stress that nowadays it's also important to look at the development perspective, because sustainable development goals become ever more important in different countries, and therefore when we assess how the policies are being implemented, it's also important to see whether and how they contribute to the economic, social, and environmental aspects of sustainable development. And last but not least, when I'm coming to the rule of law effects of EU regional trade agreements, there are several other, let's say, directions of literature that one can look at, and they are in more detail considered in the book that was mentioned by Kamala, that I published in April this year based on my PhD thesis. So the key ideas in this book are that, first of all, the rule of law is not something easy to define. It's a so-called essentially contested concept, and what I do in this study is just to map its key components. so I don't claim my mapping is the best one and the most comprehensive one. However, it's based on different contributions on the rule of law, both contemporary ones and older ones, and that's why I think it's quite comprehensive and can be also used as an operationalization for research. And when we speak about the theoretical preconditions, like basically why do I think that trade agreements can improve the rule of law, there one can refer to development economics literature. So unfortunately, due to the lack of time, I cannot really go into depth in all these theories. However, at least there are three key development economics theories, like the older modernization theory and the more novel institutional economics and governance approaches that stipulate that institutions and their legal framing are of importance for economic development. Least is being said about whether this effect works vice versa, and we can say that economic development can produce legal change. However, there are also some empirical contributions that point to these, and also the literature on EU civilian normative power, on EU market and trade power, as well as the quite an interesting contribution by Tina Freiburg and her colleagues on democracy promotion through functional cooperation that say that functional cooperation, especially cooperation in the domain of trade, can literally improve democracy. And since democracy and the rule of law are also closely intertwined, these enabled me to come to the conclusion that, at least in theory, EU regional trade agreements should be incapable of promoting the rule of law, especially given their scope, since nowadays they include not just trade in goods, but also a lot of regulations about trade in services, public procurement, competition, state aid, transparency, health, labor rights, and so on and so forth. So the agreements became so expensive and they include so many norms that they inevitably influence domestic legal system quite profoundly, and with these change quite technical standards, yet the ones that are also very important for the functioning of the rule of law. So coming to the case of the EU-Ukraine deep trade agenda, it's important to say that EU-Ukraine trade relations are very much rooted in the EU's reorientation from the reliance on WTO, on multilateral trade liberalization, to the promotion of the ambitious B and plurilateral deep trade agenda. So this turn, it actually took place in 2006 when the EU decided it would not only promote the integration in terms of the WTO, but will also pursue its own path as a trade power. So there is even a specific communication one can look at by the European Commission where this change is highlighted. However, even before this, the 2004 EU-Ukraine Action Plan has been quite ambitious with respect to the subsequent trade liberalization. It also includes the preparation. It also includes the preparation for Ukraine's WTO accession and some initial legislative approximation efforts. And it took 13 years until this plan was first introduced to the year 2017, when the accession agreement and the Dcft started to be fully applied. So the objectives behind the Dcft include to establish the conditions for enhanced economic and trade relations that would lead to Ukraine's gradual integration in the EU internal market. So we see that the Dcft, it quite clearly sets the ambition of Ukraine to be integrated into the EU internal market, and also it is claimed that the Dcft aims to support Ukrainian efforts to complete the transition into a functioning market economy that includes, inter alia, the progressive approximation of Ukraine's legislation to that of the Union. And therefore, given the ambitiousness of these aims behind the DCFTA, we cannot speak only about the DCFTA as the document that shapes EU-Ukraine trade relations. Therefore, I speak about the EU-Ukraine deep trade agenda that naturally includes the DCFTA, but also an array of unilateral assistance instruments, such as different instruments for technical assistance, multiple projects in all these technical domains like competition, public procurement, health, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, and so on. There has been also a quite important project in Ukraine called EU-PAR that provided for direct financing for the reform posts in the ministries, including the Ministry for Economic Development and Trade. So actually the EU really tried contributing to the capacity building of Ukrainian ministries through these noble, as they called, reform posts. The DCFTA's implementation is being supported by direct financing for small and medium-sized enterprises. This is called the DCFTA Facility for Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises, and various programs for civil society support. Furthermore, apart from actual DCFTA and actual assistance instruments, one shall take into account that the deep trade agenda envisages the prospect of deeper single market integration, and this includes the EU-Ukraine update that is currently being planned. So for the time being, the Government Office for European and Euro-Atlantic Integration is actively working on updating and further deepening the DCFTA so that the DCFTA becomes more beneficial for Ukrainian exporters, so that the quotas are lifted, and also there is more room for integration with regard to trade and services and financial markets. So actually this update is also quite a unique and ambitious project, because it would be the first update among the Eastern Partnership countries, and therefore it's also quite interesting to see whether it would be agreed on and how much time the EU and Ukraine would require to do so. So speaking about impact, I divide I distinguish various dimensions of impact the DCFTA had and the deep trade agenda have had on Ukraine. They include first and foremost the trade and economic impact. These, first of all, includes the increase of EU-Ukraine total trade volumes and Ukraine's exports to the EU. However, these shall not be equated to the welfare gains. So we shouldn't say that in case we see an exports increase, this definitely means that Ukraine got some economic benefits from these. Also, what has been quite a notable trend is the reorientation of Ukraine's business from the Russian market and the market of the Commonwealth of Independent States to the Western ones, and the rise of third country as Ukraine's import partners, such as China, Turkey, USA, Switzerland. And the reason for this is that Ukraine's rules came closer to the EU ones, the ones quite widely used, and therefore even for third countries, this has become quite convenient. However, there are still several weaknesses and threats in this vein. The weaknesses are that, for instance, Ukraine has still problems with the exports of services and investment cooperation, mostly due to the role flow issue, especially when we speak about investment. Investors are not always so quick to come to Ukraine because they fear issues with property or with courts, and therefore they may stay aside or choose other countries in the region, such as Georgia, that is somehow more investment friendly. Also, with regard to the trade and economic aspects, there is currently quite a threat of the weakening of Ukraine's position at the gas transit market due to the launch of the Nord Stream 2 pipe, as well as the challenges to the exports of Ukrainian products due to the new carbon tax that the EU plans to introduce. Moreover, this process of Ukraine's reorienting from the Russian market and the market of the Commonwealth of Independent States, it's not a one-day process. It's also not so smooth because of the common language, because of the business links that have been existing for a long time, and therefore Ukrainian exporters also lose quite some money on these. And this is the reason why the rise of EU-Ukraine total trade volume, it doesn't all the time cover these losses, and these losses account for the fact that Ukrainian trade picture is not so bright at this time, and it's evident that more time is required to totally switch from these markets to the Western ones. Speaking about sustainable development, here on the screen you can see sustainable development goals, the ones that are currently serving as an important benchmark for assessing different initiatives worldwide. As for Ukraine, how did the deep trade agenda impact sustainable development? Nowadays, definitely the macroeconomic situation and the labor market, they're challenged quite extensively due to the corona pandemic. However, as we can see, for instance, from the government reports, the deep trade agenda is believed to have had a positive impact on small and medium-sized enterprises. For instance, there has been quite a considerable rise of a number of people who are employed by small and medium-sized enterprises, and a stronger emphasis on innovation as it was before. Also, Ukraine improved its position in the innovation rating. However, the environmental dimension remains quite troubled, despite the fact that the EU has many environmental projects in Ukraine. There are still issues in the domains of biodiversity, the regulation of genetically modified organisms, the protection of water resources, and the completion of the waste management system reform. Also, the Dcft has quite limited social aspect, and therefore it had some special structural effects on the social sphere when it comes, for instance, to the protection of labor rights. Yet the issues of pensions, health, social services are still requiring further development and further projects. Yet it's also important to underline that currently the awareness about the importance of integrating economic, environmental, and social aspects of sustainable development is rising. Also, when we speak about the implementation of Dcft, so some new tools are being developed to to trace the effects of the Dcft and the deep trade agenda in a more integrated manner that will also take into account environmental and social aspects. When it comes to the legal domain, let's say here the effects and the impact of the deep trade agenda are most salient. The Dcft provides for an impressive convergence of the EU's and Ukrainian regulatory spaces. So nowadays there are many legislation there is in common between the EU and Ukraine, and many practices and frameworks for administrative and technical cooperation have been put in place. Yet Ukraine hasn't complied with all its obligations evenly, because there are still the domains like, for instance, transport or financial cooperation, where Ukraine's compliance rates are like 25% or 30% out of 100. Yet, for instance, when we speak about public procurement or countering technical barriers to trade, the situation looks much more optimistic. This legislative approximation definitely has important indirect effects on democracy and the rule of law, and this has resulted in the rise of Ukraine's position in the Doing Business rating. I know the Doing Business rating has been quite discredited during this year, and it wouldn't be published by the World Bank anymore. Yet for Ukraine, it has been an important challenge to move forward in this rating. However, there is still quite some corruption and rule of law challenges persisting, and when we look at other ratings like the rule of law index published by the World Justice Project or the corruption perceptions index, the situation is also quite mixed. When we speak about the rule of law, Once again, we would have definitely some progress, and it's indeed the Dcft that exerted such progress. For instance, when we speak about transparency, the state's obligation to publish legislation, and also the draft law, the chances for business community to take a more active part in consultations in the development of draft laws, EU accountability and transparency provisions, for instance, in the domain of public procurement and competition, such as the launch of the quite famous Prozoro procurement e-system. Also, Ukraine became more compatible with international rules, especially when we speak about trade, environment, and energy, and this has been integrally made to avoid new EU carbon taxes. The Dcft has also served as an important impetus to deregulation, because before Ukraine had very complicated rules for business, and nowadays they have been simplified so that small and medium-sized business has more chances to find where they stay in legal terms. Yet, once again, the challenges of high-level corruption and the attempts to circumvent new systems are persisting. And for instance, in the internet, you can find a lot of advice about how to circumvent this Prozoro system of e-procurement or some other new legislations. Last but not least, coming to resilience, Buddha says the resilience of the deep trade agenda is quite high, and one can exemplify this statement, for instance, by its high flexibility, including the EU's application of autonomous trade measure to help Ukraine sustain the shocks after the Revolution of Dignity and the Russian annexation of Crimea and sponsorship for unrest in eastern Ukraine. There has been also the quite flexible and gradual nature of tariffs removal under the Dcft and quite long transition periods that helped Ukrainian producers to adjust. Legislative approximation is also designed in a very flexible and gradual way, and there has been extensive technical support in this regard, so that all these changes don't just have to be adopted tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, but they are thoroughly thought about and supported in different ways. Furthermore, in many domains, the Dcft requires Ukraine to approximate its legislation not to regulations, but EU directives, and these provides Ukraine with a chance to decide on specific measures it would take to implement these directives. There are also negotiations possible within the Association Council, yet the resilience, or at least its flexibility dimension, can be challenged by the persistence of exception to trade liberalization and different lengthy bureaucratic procedures to review the agreement. On the bright side, the Dcft and deep trade agenda also have high forward-looking quality, since they provide for integration into the single market for Ukraine in 3 domains: trade, services, and capital. There is the prospect of signing the agreement about conformity, the ACA, or called differently, the industrial visa-free regime for Ukrainian products. Also, an evolving, and I would say rapidly evolving domain has been the digital single market integration, and there is a possibility definitely to update the agreement and add ever new disciplines and cooperation domains. However, when we speak about the challenges, we all know that the association agreement between the EU and Ukraine doesn't provide for the membership perspective, and this kind of integration without membership framework definitely has its political limitations, because policymakers would really like to have this kind of a perspective and see some move forward in terms of political cooperation, yet this doesn't happen due to many political reasons, geopolitical reasons, and therefore these can be a source for disillusionment for both policymakers and general public, and these may also at some point exert negative influence on the further development of EU-Ukraine trade relations. So to conclude, so far the EU-Ukraine deep trade agenda has had limited impact, and this impact has been marked by a mixed account. On the one hand, there have been some crucial developments when we speak both about the reorientation of Ukraine to the new markets, about legislative approximation, legislative change, the rule of law and democracy promotion. On the other hand, this long tail of legacy of incomplete transformation is still with us, despite some areas of the rule of law. When we speak about transparency and accountability, the use of technologies for the rule of law have advanced. However, the EU agenda is marked by quite high resilience, and there is a hope for stronger impact in the domains of trade, sustainable development, law and politics, especially when we speak now about the post-pandemic future, when our assessments of cooperation wouldn't be, let us say, spoiled by the negative effects of the corona pandemic. So if there was no pandemic, I would say we would have had different results for now, yet this challenge is still highly important for Ukraine, given the low vaccination level and very high death tolls for now, and that's why it's also difficult to predict how these would influence the process of the agreements update, both in bureaucratic, institutional terms and substantially. However, I would hope this situation would also improve and change this year and next year. So this has been all for now. Thank you for your attention, and I would be happy to continue the discussion and answer your questions if you have some.
Thank you, Maryna. Thank you very much. That was really informative and interesting overview of the EU-Ukraine trade agenda and its foundations and main pillars. And now, as you mentioned, we can start our short Q&A session. And just to remind our viewers, if you would like to submit a question, please, you can do so by sending it via the chat window on YouTube. So, Maryna, my first question to you concerns the problem of coherence, the degree of consistency of such value-driven trade policy of the EU, particularly in terms of Ukraine. Now, there are various official documents of the EU which underline that the EU trade policy is not just about interests, but also about values, and emphasize the specificity of EU trade agreement to serve as a force in protecting or projecting values beyond the EU borders. But there is also an important body of information on the EU's dual role, which it plays through its trade policy, which you also mentioned in your book. The EU simultaneously aims at promoting Europe's own material growth, well-being, and at the same time enhancing sustainable development in the neighborhood via upgrading the rule of law situation. Meaning that on the one hand, the EU strives to increase its own economic power and well-being through a kind of market power projection, while at the same time it projects human rights, it protects human rights, and promotes a good governance via normative power projection. Even though in the global strategy adopted in 2016, as you know, the EU is asserted the concept of principled pragmatism to balance the EU interests and normative aspirations. The question remains to what extent the EU succeeds in striking the right balance between self-interest and fundamental values in its external economic and commercial policy. And what are the regions from your standpoint where Brussels can be seen as most effective in this sense?
Thank you for this question. I think it's quite expensive and really goes beyond the Eastern neighborhood. Let's say when we speak about trade and its value effects, on the one hand, we can argue that trade is a safer area with regard to values than traditional political dialogue and political support, and the EU has less chances to meet its common democracy stability dilemma when it comes to trade, because usually such issues arise with regard to general political strategy in some countries. For instance, if we remember the Southern neighborhood and Arab Spring, the EU was many times accused of the fact that it supported old regimes because it put an emphasis on stability and security, constituting its self-interest more than on genuine democracy that could have included the support for protesters. So when we speak about trade, we don't have these very sensitive political issues that concern support for specific domestic political forces. However, when we speak about the regions with higher economic advances and the countries with high bargaining power, yet autocratic regimes, there the EU has less chances to promote values and has the same more and can be more inclined to sometimes sacrifice values for commercial interests. As an example, one could speak about the EU's negotiations with Singapore about trade agreements. There have been some articles, for instance, by Meissner and McKinsey from 2017 and 19, where they zoom in on how the negotiations between the EU and Singapore were taking place. And after their interviews with negotiators, they have some direct evidence that Singapore pressed the EU to soften the formulations about human rights, about democracy. Also, if we take a look at the EU's agreements with Arab countries, we wouldn't have these norms. Also, the fact that some countries are autocratic, like the countries of like Emirates or Qatar, also prevent the EU from even starting the negotiations about trade because they would immediately know that these agreements would be strictly commercial. But also the fact that the EU would strike such agreements can lead to criticisms about the EU's normative power. So in some cases, such as with Singapore, the EU could sacrifice a bit, but in case there would be a massive refusal to include any even essential element clauses when we come to these countries like Emirates or Qatar, the EU may even not think of starting the negotiations. On the other hand, when we speak of countries like Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, or the Western Balkans countries, then the EU would have more bargaining power and more leeway, and therefore it can make these trade agreements, let's say, more elaborate when we speak about the rule of law, democracy, and human rights. It has more leeway, and the countries are at least discursively agreeing to having these standards, yet the implementation and practices can be already the domain where the EU would require more attention to these issues and more capacity building support to get these standards implemented.
Yeah, and actually at this point we can turn our attention to the question of a symmetrical relationship between the so-called norm maker and norm taker sides in terms of negotiating and concluding value promoting trade agreements. An important point to mention actually in this regard is the discrepancy between liberalization and the rule of law promotion in the enlargement policy as opposed to the neighborhood policy, which you also differentiate in your book. Could you elaborate on this difference? And as a follow-up to this question, do you think it's viable to see a clear membership perspective on, or the absence of such perspective as a major determinant of the norm takers' capacity and willingness to implement non-trade policy conditionality? Do you think that in development promotion policies, the mere rule transfer to a partner country without integrating it into the EU's own economic and legal system will serve the ultimate goal of convergence between the EU and the targeted country, particularly countries such as Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, with still persisting post-Soviet challenges and difficulties? And in short, what in your opinion is the ideal type of equivalent partner for the EU in value-driven trade negotiations to achieve a genuine convergence?
Yeah, thank you for this question, and actually this set of questions, maybe starting from the beginning. I really believe that membership perspective, at least for some time, can be seen as a factor that is conducive to the promotion of the rule of law and democracy via trade. However, we should also understand that incentives only work for some time. In order for incentives to work and for convergence to take place, you always need some new upgraded incentives. And since the Balkans have had the membership perspective for a long time, and now there is also the lack of consensus in the EU whether Balkans will actually exceed the Union and become members. The value of this membership perspective, it decreases, and therefore now this difference may be less striking as it could have been like 10 years ago when most of these countries got the membership perspective. So I think the membership perspective matters, but its validity is limited in terms of time. In general, as from membership perspective for Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, on the one hand, I would love to say that it's feasible, and also due to the fact that EU, Moldova, and Georgia formed the association trio in order to be able to move together towards integration to the EU. On the other hand, when we see the EU global strategy and the EU being very cautious about Russia, I would say that the EU wouldn't risk so much in terms of granting these countries a membership perspective amid the threat of Russia's further escalation in the region. And speaking about the ideal partner, I would say that the Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia are not quite bad partners when we speak about the role of law promotion via trade, because this type of the role of law promotion is quite technical, and sometimes the standards that the Dcft include are also of quite technical nature and not just directly aimed at tackling the role of law challenges. So these are definitely not the worst partners. I would say the worst ones would be really these very rich countries, but at the same time autocratic, such as the ones that I mentioned in my response to the previous question, like the Emirates or Qatar. At the same time, when we speak about non-trade policy objectives and the trade and sustainable development chapters in different contexts, like in Peru, for instance, in South Korea, in other countries, then a degree to which there would be convergence would largely depend on many factors, like starting from the political will or the various cultural factors. For instance, when the EU had these kind of panel with South Korea about labor issues, the panel came to the conclusion that the parties had very disparate industrial relations systems just historically, and therefore it has been extremely difficult for South Korea to comply with the EU rules. So this didn't mean that the panel didn't oblige South Korea to comply. However, its investigation shows that it's not always easy to comply, and therefore these historical legacies also matter as much as political will and cultural factors.
Thank you, Maryna. And my last question concerns the Agenda 2030, which you also mentioned, sustainable development, you also mentioned in your presentation. Agenda 2030, as you know, includes a collection of 17 interlinked global goals, so-called SDGs, set up in 2015 by the UN General Assembly, and designed to be a blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. Now, in terms of the EU Foreign Policy Actor and sustainable development, as you point out in your presentation, has also been recognized as a general objective of the whole range of EU external policies, including commercial policy. And I wonder how much the EU's policy towards its eastern neighbors has a sustainable development-driven design. How much is it can be seen in this framework, can be assessed in this framework?
So basically, I think back to 2015 or 16, one of the EU's communication introduced the framework to kind of restructure EU policies with regard to sustainable development goals and their targets. Actually, the Eastern neighborhood policy and Eastern Partnership, they weren't such like immediately restructured, yet if we see the substance of the projects the EU is currently implementing in the Eastern Partnership, I would argue they are more sustainable development oriented as before, especially because the EU significantly strengthened the environmental aspect. When we speak, for instance, of the program like EU for climate change, EU against climate change, or it's called EU for climate in the Eastern Partnership, or energy initiatives, the ones directed to promote clean energy. Also with the corona pandemic, now health policies came to the forefront, and this advances the social aspect of sustainable development. However, as I mentioned in my presentation, there are still some aspects that are really beyond the EU's reach in Eastern Partnership countries. This is, for instance, the operation of the pension systems, because in Ukraine, also in Moldova and Georgia, pensions are quite low, and the institutional capacity of these institutions that govern pensions is also quite bad. For instance, they don't invest money, and they just get some subventions from the government and don't try to improve their own financial capacities. Also, people working there are usually quite old and they don't know how technologies function, and therefore these institutions are super outdated, though the EU, to my knowledge, hasn't made any sustainable efforts to deal with them. Also, these are the issues concerning housing. Apart from housing for IDPs in Eastern Ukraine, the EU never looked at housing, I think, Ukraine-wide consistently. Also in Moldova and Georgia, health has only recently came to the forefront. Youth has always been there, yet there are also quite some youth policy problems in these countries that the EU could have tackled. So I would say the environmental dimension is upgrading now, the health dimension is, but there are also other social issues that require further attention, and I would argue it would be important for the EU to strengthen the social aspect of its policies in order to get more support from general public, because sometimes we have this deep gap between progress on EU integration and the opinion of the general public about it, because people don't really feel the effects of European integration and then claim it's solely a political project, and they would like to see some tangible results that are sometimes lacking.
Thank you, Maryna. I guess we are approaching the end of our event and we have to close now. I'm grateful to you, Maryna, for having given up your time to participate in this webinar, and thank you for sharing your insights and expertise with us today. We greatly appreciate it. And as soon as we overcome the whole pandemic situation, actually, and be able to go back to the in-person conferences, I personally and also our rector, Professor Yücel Oğurlu, and the head of our department, Dr. Üyesi Kamala, would like to see you here at Istanbul at our university. And thank you a lot. Thanks a lot, Maryna, and hope to see you again. Thank you.
Yeah, many thanks, Kamala. Many thanks for inviting.
Thank you.